Warning! Tube amplifiers have lethal voltages inside them. Please do not attempt to build, test, or repair these without understanding and following all safety protocols. Hey y'all! Well, I know this has been kind of a long series, but I told you I was going to do one with some detail showing you step by step how to do this thing. And I know maybe not showing every second of everything that I do, but I think I'm showing you enough to know what to do and hopefully what not to do. You're going to see a few mistakes in this build. Hey, you know, it happens. And so maybe you'll learn something from that. So anyway, let's get to working on the preamp. Okay, the first thing we need to do is prep the RCA jacks to be soldered to the top of the board, which are the two output RCA jacks. And we're going to be using some 2-conductor shielded wire to connect them to the board. We're going to have the shielded end at the board, and we have the shield pulled up and connected to the negative lead. You can see the red positives by itself. And then on the other end, we just have the 2 conductors come out, so the shielding's only connected at the circuit board end. And it's a little short piece of wire like that. So the first thing we have to do is we file the coating off of the terminal here that we're going to be soldering to make sure we get a good connection to the brass. Get the iron nice and hot, cleaned up, and then we're going to come in and tin this connector here where we're going to be soldering to. And you want to have the soldering iron on here a pretty good while and have some cold water nearby to cool off the jack. And you want to get the terminal hot enough where the solder melts when you're touching it to the terminal. Like that. And not just to the iron. And then we dip this in some water. We don't want to melt that plastic conductor. So we come back and we heat this little pool of solder up, drop our wire in. And then quench it in the cool water again. Then we have our ground lead connected. And then we're going to come in here and solder in our positive connection. And obviously it's being a lot thinner, heats up really quick. And there's our RCA connector soldered to the shielded wire. And it's ready to solder onto the board. So the next thing we need to do is solder the other end of this shielded wire to the board. One way of doing this, and I just realized there might even be a simpler way of doing this, but this and this are the connectors when you're not using the potentiometer that can be put right here. And in the past, I've just run a jumper from here to here so that these 2 holes that are right next to each other are the positive and the negative. And so we're going to just put these jumpers in like I've been doing in my other boards. And there's our 2 little jumpers soldered in place. So now we can use this hole as the positive and that one as the negative. Set our positive wire right there. Solder it to that hole. And then stand it up. Come in here and solder the ground one in. And there's that output connector. And then do the same with this pair. And make sure that the wire doesn't go through and the insulation is in the hole. Make sure you have the bare wire in the hole. It's real easy for this to like slip in and let the insulation be inside the hole, and then obviously it's not going to make a connection, and the insulation might melt and the solder's melted and it looks like it's all connected and it's really not connected to anything. And it doesn't hurt to come in with an ohm meter and just check that that's actually made a connection. And there we go. And make sure that you don't like cook this capacitor with your soldering iron when you're doing this either. Just always be aware, especially when you're soldering stuff like this after the caps are in place, that you're not going to cook the capacitors. And now these will like twist around and sit like that up through the top of the chassis with both of the wires towards the center. And then this one will be like that. So we got that done. The next thing we need to do before we install the board is we need to solder some extension leads onto the LED before we solder it in here so it sits flush with this standoff. So let me solder a couple of leads on there and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, when I was editing the video, I was like, OMG, I'm an idiot. I soldered this connector into the wrong pins. I put it here and here, and it's supposed to be here and here. And that's what can happen when you're not paying attention. So I had to pull the board back out of the case, and I'm glad I was actually videoing this, but honestly, I probably wouldn't have made this mistake if I'd been just building this thing and not making a video. So anyway, pull that out. Come in here and solder this connector in. And then come in here and solder the ground one in. And there we go. Now back to our regularly scheduled program. So we soldered a couple of wires onto our indicator LED to extend it up, and I'll show you why we did that in a moment. But we want to figure out which is the positive and the negative for sure. The easiest way to do it is to get your voltmeter and switch through till you come to your diode test, and then if you hook it up right, you can see it's lighting up. So we know this lead is our positive. So to keep us from getting mixed up, we're just going to put a little heat shrink tubing over it like that. And then before we shrink this down, I'm going to slide the negative one on here. I want to cut this to the right length, and you want to cut it just a little shorter than the length of your stands that you're using. So there's that one. And then we're going to cut this one to the same length. And then it won't hurt anything to just double check you're putting it in the right orientation. And there it's lighting up. Might be hard for you to see it, but I can see it. And then this is a little trick I use, is just use the non-solder kind of tip part of the soldering iron to come in and shrink up this heat shrink tubing. Doesn't have to be a perfect job either, but you just keep it from sliding around a little bit while you're installing it in the board. And this is the last step before we install the board into the chassis. And it's marked here. Let me zoom in here. You can see it's marked with the positive and the negative. Doesn't really matter which of these two holes you put the leads in, whichever one's easier to, or they happen to go in. And then you want to set the LED so that the little collar part of it is just below the standoff like that, so that when you install it, the little stop collar goes up against the bottom of the chassis. So once you get it kind of set at the right height, come over and bend the leads over on the back side like that. And solder this guy in place. Just like that. And then trim those off. And the last thing before we install the board in the chassis is this 33K resistor right here. And this is the dropping resistor for the indicator LED. And it sets the brightness level. And I think they're a little too bright when they're at 33K, so I've been putting 47K ones in it. On this one and all of them going forward, I'm going to solder this resistor on the other side of the board. The reason being that the last one I sold to a friend of mine, he wanted this brighter. And the resistor being on this side made it difficult, and I had to just, solder another resistor on the other side to make it a little brighter. But it would be easier just to swap out the resistor if somebody wanted the brightness level different. So it's easy enough to just solder it on this side of the board. So come in here and solder that. And then solder this other side. And we are done. We are ready to install the board into the chassis. And I was going to show you here too. If you remember, I put these two capacitors on the bottom like this and laid them down sideways. And by doing that, that gave us some extra room, because normally they would sit over here, and we were able to put this nice big heatsink on the transistor, which was a bonus. So let's drop this thing in the chassis and get that part done, and then we just have a few more wires to hook up and we'll be finished with this thing. Okay, and this is kind of a frustrating part of doing this build, is trying to get the board into the chassis and fish these RCA jacks through these holes in the top of the chassis. And one of the things I found that makes it extra frustrating is these little washers try to fall off the whole time you're doing this. So I highly recommend getting some kind of contact adhesive, putting a little bit on these washers so they don't fall off while you're trying to put this thing together, because it becomes super frustrating when every time, like, you'll get one in place and then the washer falls off the other one and you're like, crap, gotta start all over. So and clean that little bit of glue up later. Might have been smarter to put the glue on the jack, but here we are. So I'm going to let that sit up a minute, and then I'm going to try to fish this whole thing together off camera because it's pretty irritating. And it's, to me, the really kind of just irritating last little part of this deal. And almost forgot to trim those two resistor leads off. So just kind of double check everything one last time, and then, like I said, you're just going to have to kind of fight with this thing a little bit. Sometimes having a screwdriver that you can stick through the hole and kind of help guide that through, or grab it with some little pliers like that helps. But let me get busy with this, and then also you have to guide this LED through the hole in the top of the chassis and then put the screws in place. So let me go deal with this. Okay, so I got that part done, and like I said, that's a little tricky part of this build. The way I do it, making those shielded cables as short as I do, is getting these things fished through and then getting these washers and nuts and everything put on. And like I said, without gluing the bottom one on, you'll just drop it 50 times. And so definitely get a little contact glue, glue the bottom washer on, and then, you know, kind of fish them through. And you have to hold it up while you start the nut and spin it down, and then kind of move it around and make sure you've got that shouldered washer centered in the hole before you snug these down. And then tightening these down isn't real easy either. About all you can do is kind of put your finger through here and try to hold it, keep it from turning on the back side while you tighten these up. You might need to kind of preload them so that as they turn a little bit, they'll, you know, it is what it is. And these don't have to get super tight because they don't have a ring connector on it. You've soldered the ground wire directly to the body, so the tightness of these nuts has nothing to do with how well they're connected. So just get them as snug as you can, and that's about all you can do. I think that's better than putting big long wires in there. So you can tighten these up super tight and hold them on the back side, and then have a bunch of loose cable in there that could pick up signal and noise at this low level that these things are dealing with. And as you can see, got the LEDs sticking up through the hole too. When I tighten these screws up, it'll come up a little more. And this is where you find out how well you drilled these holes. You know, you can wiggle these around a little bit. If you really have a hard time getting them lined up, you can loosen up the screws on the back side of the board so the stands can move around a little bit to get the screws started. Don't tighten up anything until you get them all started, and then just come in and tighten these guys up. And then I just kind of work my way around the board. You can hear it pulling it up through the screws. And I'm really curious what this preamp's going to look like with the slightly shorter standoffs, with the tubes should stick out a little more than they have on my previous builds. And that was kind of the goal with this, so the tubes would be easier to get in and out, yet still be shielded by being, you know, countersunk into the chassis a little bit. Plus, I know some people really want to be able to see the tubes. One of these that I sold, the guy really wanted to see the tubes glowing, so he put some socket extenders on them so that the tubes sat up flush with the top edge. Hey, it's his preamp if that's what he wants to do. I think there's some value to the tubes being down inside the hole a little bit to help deal with, you know, if they're possibly microphonic a little bit. But like I said, I think there's a kind of a mixture of what people enjoy with audio gear, and the aesthetics of this gear, I believe, is part of the enjoyment of it. So that's why DIY stuff's so fun, is you can make it look how you want it to. And after I get all these tight, then I'll flip it over and tighten up the Allen bolts on the inside. And like I said, see the LED sticks up a little higher now. And then we're going to flip it over and make sure all these Allen bolts on the inside are snug too. Pretty sure I got them fairly snug, but again, like I said, if you have a hard time starting them on the other side, you can always loosen these up on the inside and then get all the screws started, tighten up on the top side, then come back and tighten them on the bottom side. It's not going to hurt anything. It's not like you're going to, unless you've got them way off, it's not going to like break the board or anything. There's not going to put that much tension on them. If they're way off, you might want to regroup and just realize that, okay, I screwed up, I'm going to have an extra hole here, or something like that, but they don't have to be perfect. And there we go. Now we got our board installed. And we can still get to, you can see we can still get to the transformer nuts to put those on. Wiring up the switch isn't going to be any problem. And then all we've got to do here in the front is put these RCA jacks in. And I'm not going to use shielded wire here. I'm just going to run wires from here down to the board. And then this hole right here is the ground for the chassis to the signal. And the turntable ground is in the same place. And then, like I said, back here, this hole here is for our safety ground. So let me go get some tubes and pop it in this thing and see what it looks like with the shorter standoffs. Here we go. Got a set of 7025 electroharmonic tubes in it, and I think that looks great. They're sticking up out of the top just a little bit, and they're a little more than my previous versions of this, which will allow you just to easily, grab the tube and pull it out, where before it was just like that much sticking out. It was maybe a half an inch deeper, where it was like only that much of the tube was sticking out, or like that much, and it made it really difficult to pull out and put the tubes back in. And that way too, you can really see the tops of the tubes, which I think looks cool. So yeah, that turned out great. So I need to bolt down the power transformer, install the power switch, put the IEC socket on, put the choke in. We'll wire up all the power supply stuff in the back, and then just wire up the two RCA jacks in the front and the chassis ground, phono ground in the front, and we'll be done with this thing. So I think one more short episode will wrap this thing up, and this is probably a good place to wrap up this video. Well, I hope y'all are learning some stuff from this series, and this is a fun project. I always enjoy building these things. Like I've said before, I built probably a half a dozen of these things, and they've been a little different between each version, but I've kind of narrowing it down to how I build these things now. So anyway, if you're enjoying this series, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and thanks to all you Patreon folks and you folks that make donations to the website. I really appreciate that. And until the next video, have a nice day.